Before he fell, I watched him walk in sunlight, not the kind that warms the skin, but the kind that blinds the soul. He had everything a man could desire: a house filled with laughter, a wife whose smile felt like peace, a child who ran into his arms as if the world outside didn't exist. He prayed every night. He thanked me for his blessings, but not once did he seek my presence beyond the comfort of gratitude. He believed faith was a ritual, a candle lit, a verse repeated, a request answered. But I do not dwell in rituals. I dwell in hearts that ache for me even when the answers never come. He thought he knew me, yet he only knew my gifts. He mistook stability for faith and fortune for favor. And so as I watched, I saw his world become his God, and I, his distant memory. In the quiet hours before dawn, he would stand before the mirror and whisper, "I built this life." And he was right. He built it. But what is built without me cannot stand the weight of eternity. I whispered to him many times, in the stillness between his breaths, in the faces of the poor he ignored, in the silence after his prayers. But his ears were closed by comfort, and comfort, my child, is a softer cage than pain. It teaches you nothing but fear of losing what you think you own. He loved his plans more than my will. He loved the image of perfection more than the truth of surrender. And so when the time came, I did not stop the wind that would tear it all apart. Not because I did not love him, but because love that never allows breaking is not love at all. Every soul that belongs to me must at least once be emptied, so that I may fill it with what cannot be taken away. And as he smiled at his reflection that morning, unaware of the storm forming beyond the horizon, I whispered softly, almost in sorrow, "Soon, you will understand that what you have is not who you are." The sky above him was calm. The air still carried the scent of comfort, but the foundations of his peace were already trembling, not in punishment, but in mercy. Because I was preparing to rebuild him, even if I had to let him break first. The fall never begins with thunder. It begins with silence, the kind that no one notices until it has swallowed everything. He woke one morning, and the world felt slightly colder. The same sun rose above his window, but it didn't shine the same way. The laughter of his child, once the music of his mornings, sounded distant, almost fragile, like a melody remembered, not lived. He thought it was fatigue. He thought it was stress. He did not know it was me, beginning the slow unraveling of everything that had chained his heart to the illusion of control. That day, he went to work as he always did. Polished shoes, pressed shirt, a confident smile that masked the growing emptiness inside. People still greeted him with admiration. They still said, "You're lucky, you have everything." He smiled back, but luck is a fragile god, and his was about to die. When he reached his office, the whispers had already begun. The company he built was trembling under debts he ignored. The trusted friend he raised to power had turned greed into betrayal. And as he sat before the numbers that no longer balanced, he felt the first crack in the glass cage he called his success. I watched him stare at those papers, not as punishment, but as the beginning of his freedom. Because sometimes, to save a man from himself, I must first let him watch his world collapse piece by piece. That night, he didn't pray. He was too tired, too proud, too afraid of what he might hear if he did. And in the darkness of his room where his wife slept beside him, he whispered into the emptiness, "Why does it feel like you're gone?" But I was not gone. I was closer than ever, waiting for the moment when his strength would finally fail so that mine could begin. Days turned into weeks, and the air around him grew heavier. Calls came. Banks, investors, friends who spoke with the politeness of people preparing to leave. He began to lose the rhythm of life. Meals uneaten, promises broken, eyes that stared into nothing. His wife tried to reach him, but his silence built walls higher than her love could climb. He did not see her tears. He did not hear her prayers. He was too busy wrestling the invisible, trying to hold on to what was already leaving. I sent him signs, not of anger, but of mercy. The child who asked him, "Daddy, why are you sad?" The friend who said, "It's okay to start over." The dream that came again and again, of him standing on an empty shore while the tide erased his footprints. but he woke each time with fear, not faith. He believed I was taking everything away. He did not yet understand I was giving him back his soul. Then came the day the doors closed. The company fell. The headlines wrote his name with pity, and the people who once called him Sir now called him Example. That night he sat in the dark, the weight of failure pressing on his chest like a stone. He thought of ending it all, not his life, but his will to try. He whispered into the void, "If you loved me, you wouldn't let this happen." And I answered, not with thunder, but with a tear he didn't know was mine. "If I didn't love you, I would have let you stay the same." But he didn't hear. Humans rarely do when the world they built begins to crumble. They think love means protection from pain, not purpose through it. In the days that followed, he lost his home. The family moved into a smaller place, the echo of their old laughter fading behind empty walls. He watched his wife pack their memories, the photos, the books, the trophies, and realized how fragile happiness is when it's built on things that can break. He began to drink the silence. It numbed the ache, blurred the edges, made it easier to forget the God he thought had forgotten him. But I was there, in the clinking of the glass, in the tears his wife wiped quietly, in the stillness that followed every night's collapse. Sometimes, I let my children reach the edge of despair, not to push them over, but to teach them that falling into my arms is not the same as falling into nothing. One evening, he walked aimlessly through the city. The rain fell without mercy, soaking his clothes, washing the last traces of dignity from his face. He stopped under a broken streetlight and looked up. "Are you even real?" he asked the sky. The wind answered, carrying no words, only the quiet touch of grace. He didn't recognize it, but that moment marked the beginning of his return. Because every heart that dares to question me has already begun to seek me again. I watched him cry that night. Not the tears of a man defeated, but the tears of one being undone so I could start again. Each drop that fell to the ground was a piece of pride leaving his soul. He returned home late, soaked and trembling. His child ran to him, arms open, laughter pure. And for the first time in months he knelt down and held him, really held him, feeling the heartbeat that reminded him of what still mattered. His wife watched silently, tears in her eyes, as if she sensed that something invisible had begun to shift. She did not know that I had just whispered to his heart, "You have lost much, but not me." And though he still didn't fully believe it, he went to bed that night with a strange calm, a fragile peace that only the broken can feel. In the darkness, I spoke once more. "You think this is the end, my son, but this is where I begin. I will rebuild you not with the same stones but with the dust of your surrender. And when you finally rise again, you will understand. I never wanted your success. I wanted your soul." The rain outside continued to fall, whispering like forgiveness. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, I stood beside him, unseen but unmovable, watching, waiting, loving, because though the light had faded, the dawn was already being prepared. Every soul meets a night that strips away all masks. That night he met his. It was a night without stars, the kind of darkness that doesn't just fill the room, it fills the heart. Rain whispered against the window, steady and endless, like the rhythm of grief. He sat alone on the floor, the dim light from the street outside barely touching his face. The walls seemed to breathe with him, slow, heavy, and tired. He hadn't spoken to anyone that day. The silence had become his only companion. His phone had stopped ringing, his friends had stopped visiting, and even his wife's voice had turned into a fragile echo. Words that drifted toward him but never landed. He was surrounded by everything he once called his, yet all of it felt foreign now. The furniture, the photos, the books, reminders of a man who no longer existed. He whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." And I, the God who shaped him, answered softly, "You are the clay that must be broken before it becomes art." But he didn't hear me. He was drowning too deep inside himself. Hours passed. He stood, walked to the mirror, and stared. The reflection that looked back wasn't failure. It was transformation in progress, though he couldn't see it. He saw only the ruin. He punched the mirror once. Cracks spidered across the glass like lightning. His knuckles bled. And as the blood ran down, he whispered again, "Why are you doing this to me?" I wanted to say, "Because I love you too much to let you live half awake." But he was not ready to listen. So I stayed silent, the silence that heals slowly, painfully, faithfully. He sat back down, his hands shaking. He began to remember, not his successes, but the moments he ignored me. The small lies, the selfish choices, the prayers spoken only for convenience. Each memory felt like a weight pressing on his chest. He broke, not in anger this time, but in surrender, the kind of breaking that is sacred, the kind that finally lets the light in. Tears fell without resistance, and I watched. Every tear that touched the ground was a seed, and from those seeds something divine would one day grow. He sobbed like a child. He spoke my name, not as a demand, but as a whisper of longing. "God, please, just tell me you're still here." And I was. Right beside him, unseen but closer than his own heartbeat. So I wrapped him in something no one else could see, my presence. It did not stop the pain, but it made it holy. As the night deepened, exhaustion claimed him. He lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, tears drying on his face. His breathing slowed, and in that stillness between waking and sleep, he heard it. A voice not with ears, but with the soul. "I never left you." He thought it was a dream. He turned, searching for where the voice had come from, but the room was empty. Still, his heart knew. Something had shifted, just slightly, but enough. The wound was still open, but now it had a purpose. The darkness was still heavy, but no longer endless. That night became a monument. The night he cried alone, but wasn't alone at all. Because I was there, in every breath, in every tremor, in every whisper that rose from his shattered spirit. He thought he was falling apart, but I was collecting every piece. And when morning came, I would begin to shape him again, not into the man he was, but into the man he was meant to be. "Pain," I told him, though he could not yet hear it, "is the sound of your soul growing roots in heaven." And as the first light of dawn touched his face, he finally slept, not in defeat, but in surrender. And I smiled for the first time in a long while, because now he was mine again. He thought I was gone because I stopped answering, but I was silent, only so my voice could echo louder inside him. Winter came early that year, not the kind that freezes the earth, the kind that freezes the soul. The trees outside his window stood like shadows of what once was, each branch naked, each leaf fallen, each breath of wind whispering of endings. He had stopped counting the days. The weeks had blended into one long grey ache. He still rose each morning, but not out of purpose, out of habit. He walked through life as if it were a room filled with ghosts of his past. He spoke little, smiled rarely, prayed only when the silence became unbearable. But I was there, in that silence, the same way the roots live beneath frozen ground, unseen but alive. He did not know it yet, but I was remaking him, slowly, carefully, as the winter remakes the earth. He spent long hours sitting by the window. His child played on the floor beside him, building small towers out of blocks only to knock them down again. He watched absent-mindedly until one day the boy looked up and said, "It's okay, Daddy. I can build it again." He didn't answer, but that moment, so small, so simple, rippled through him like sunlight through clouds. He didn't know that I was speaking through his child, because I speak through innocence, through laughter, through the quiet things that survive the storms. I whispered, "See? Even what falls can rise again." He didn't hear it then, but the seed was planted. He began walking at night. The streets were empty, the lamps casting soft halos on the wet pavement. He would look up at the sky, pale, cold, endless, and feel the weight of his breath turn to mist. He would think of the life he lost, the man he used to be, and wonder if I still remembered him. I did. I remembered him when he was proud. I loved him when he was lost. And I carried him now when he was too tired to walk alone. There were nights when he spoke out loud, his voice trembling. "If you're still here, give me something, anything." And I did, not in miracles, but in moments. A stranger who smiled, a friend who called, the smell of rain after months of drought. These were my gifts, small, quiet mercies that rebuild a broken heart from the edges inward. But he grew impatient. He wanted signs, not whispers. He wanted answers, not silence. So he waited, angry at the heavens that would not speak. And I waited too, because love never forces itself to be heard. It waits for the heart to become still enough to listen. In the stillness, I watched him begin to change. He no longer measured his worth by the numbers on a screen. He no longer chased approval from those who had already forgotten his name. He began to notice the morning light again, the laughter of his child, the way his wife still looked at him even when everything else was gone. He didn't realize it yet, but he was healing. And healing is always quieter than pain. One morning, he found himself holding his old Bible. It was covered in dust. He brushed it off, and the first page he opened read, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." He stared at those words for a long time. And for the first time in months, he whispered, "Maybe that's the point." I smiled, because now he was not seeking comfort. He was seeking meaning, and meaning is where faith begins. That day, he took his first step toward me again, not with his feet, but with his heart. Winter stretched on. Days passed like slow rivers beneath ice. He still struggled, he still doubted, but there was a difference now. He no longer ran from the pain. He let it exist, and in that acceptance he found strength. One evening, while sitting alone, he looked at his reflection in the window, tired, worn, but alive. And he whispered to himself, "I don't need to go back. I just need to move forward." I answered, "Yes, my son. That is how resurrection begins." From that night onward, he began to see me in the small things again. The golden hue of sunlight through frost, the laughter echoing down a hallway, the heartbeat that reminded him he was still part of something greater. He didn't know it yet, but the long winter was ending. He was not the same man who had fallen. He was softer now, humbler, truer, closer. And though he thought he was merely surviving, he was already being reborn. "Every soul must live through its winter," I whispered, "for only what endures the cold learns to bloom again." And in the distance, the first thaw began, a quiet promise that even after the longest silence, that spring was coming. When I want to speak to the heart of a man, I rarely use thunder. I use another heart. The first light of spring came quietly, the kind of dawn that looks almost fragile, unsure if it's allowed to stay. He woke to the sound of rain mixed with birdsong, a strange duet that felt both alive and mourning at once. He had no plans that morning, no meetings, no obligations, just the open space of another day and the long rebuilding of his soul. He decided to walk, not to escape, not to search, just to move. He put on his worn shoes, the same pair that had carried him through both success and ruin, and stepped outside into the cool air. The world smelled clean, as if something unseen had been washed away. He didn't know it yet, but this day would mark a quiet turning point, the moment I would send someone to remind him of what love really is. He walked aimlessly through the small town, past shops opening their doors, past people rushing toward destinations that once would have been his too. He felt invisible, not bitterly, but peacefully. It was strange how the world kept moving without him, how life continued despite his losses. He reached the edge of town where the pavement ended and the dirt road began. There, by a small wooden bench, sat an old man with a cane and a tattered coat. His hair was white, his hands weathered like paper, and his eyes were calm, almost knowing. "Beautiful morning," the stranger said. The man hesitated, then nodded. "It is." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need words. Birds flew overhead. The wind carried the scent of wet earth. The stranger smiled faintly. "You walk like a man who's lost something important." He froze. "Maybe I have." "Then you're in good company," the old man replied. Everyone on this road has lost something." He looked at the stranger closely. There was something in his tone, something weightless yet heavy, as if he spoke from both worlds at once. "I used to have everything," the man confessed. "Then I lost it, and I don't even know who I am anymore." The old man nodded slowly. "That's good," he said. "Good?" "Yes, because when you stop knowing who you are, you give God room to tell you who you were always meant to be." He stared, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "How do you know that?" The stranger tapped his chest gently. "Because he told me once when I was just like you." He said nothing, but something in his heart stirred, a warmth that had been missing for far too long. The two began walking together. The road stretched ahead, winding between hills and wildflowers. The old man spoke softly, not about religion, not about rules, but about life, about love, about the quiet faith that grows in dark soil. "I used to think God lived in churches," the stranger said, "but he doesn't live in places built by hands. He lives in moments, as in kindness, in forgiveness, in the courage to start again." The man listened, every word sinking deeper than he expected. He didn't realize it, but he was being guided, not preached to, not corrected, just gently led toward the truth. At one point they stopped by a small stream. The water was clear, dancing over stones, smoothed by years of flow. The old man sat on a rock and looked at the reflection trembling on the surface. "See that?" he said. "That's life. Never still, always moving. The water you touch now is not the same water that was there a moment ago." The man nodded slowly. "Then how do you hold on to anything?" The stranger smiled. "You don't. You let it pass and you trust that what's meant for you will flow back in its time." He looked down at the water, watching the sunlight shimmer through it. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt peace, not because his questions were answered, but because they no longer needed to be. Hours passed. When they reached the end of the path, the stranger turned to him. "This is where I leave you," he said. "Wait," the man said. "At least tell me your name." The old man smiled, a smile so calm it felt eternal. "Names don't matter. Just remember this. Sometimes God sends help in the shape of a stranger. Sometimes he sends it in the shape of silence. Either way, he's always speaking." He blinked, and for a brief moment, the light seemed to pass through the stranger instead of around him. Then, the road was empty. He looked around, confused. No footprints, no cane marks on the dirt, only the wind whispering through the grass. He stood there for a long time, eyes lifted to the sky, and in his chest, something broke open, not in pain this time, but in wonder. "You were here," he whispered. "You've always been here." He returned home different that evening. The world hadn't changed. The bills were still unpaid, the future still uncertain, but he was no longer carrying it alone. He smiled at his child, kissed his wife's forehead, and for the first time in months he said, "Thank you." Not for what he had, not for what he lost, but simply because I was still with him. And I was. I always had been. "Faith," I whispered to his heart that night, "is not born in miracles. It is born in moments like these, when the road is empty, yet you know you are not walking alone." He stopped asking me to change his life and began asking me to change his heart. The days had grown quiet again, but the quiet no longer frightened him. There was peace now in the simplicity of his mornings, the soft sound of his child's laughter, the warmth of sunlight through worn curtains, the rhythm of breathing that reminded him he was still here. He still carried the scars of his fall, some seen, others buried deep, but he no longer tried to hide them. He began to see them for what they were, reminders of the places where light had entered. He didn't realize it yet, but this was prayer, not with words but with awareness. He no longer prayed to escape pain, he prayed to understand it, and that shift changed everything. Each morning, he would walk through the small field behind his house. The grass brushed against his hands. The sky stretched endlessly, painted in colors too subtle for words. And in those moments, he began to listen differently. He started to hear me, Not in thunder, not in miracles, but in the in-between. In the spaces between footsteps, in the pause between heartbeats, in the wind that carried neither sound nor direction, only presence. The first time he noticed it, he stopped mid-step. The air was still, yet something invisible moved through it, gentle, quiet, eternal. And I whispered so softly that even the wind seemed to bow before the words. I never needed your strength. I only needed your attention. He stood there for a long time, tears forming without reason. He couldn't explain why, only that something inside him finally recognized home. He began talking to me again, not as a distant god, not as a last resort, but as a friend. While washing dishes, he'd whisper, "Thank you." While watching his son sleep, he'd say, "Please keep him safe." While walking in the rain, he'd smile and murmur, "You're still here, aren't you?" And I would answer, not in words, but in peace. The kind of peace that doesn't make sense, but fills every corner of the soul until silence itself becomes sacred. He thought he was rebuilding his life, but truly, I was rebuilding him. Brick by brick, breath by breath, prayer by prayer. One afternoon, as he sat on the porch, his wife joined him. For months they had shared the same space but lived in separate worlds. Her hurt and his shame, like two rivers running side by side but never touching. She looked at him for a long moment and said softly, "You seem different." He smiled, not wide, not forced, but real. "I think I finally stopped fighting everything," he said, "and started listening." She tilted her head. "To what?" He looked toward the horizon. "To the quiet," he said. "To God." She didn't respond, but she reached for his hand. For the first time in a long while, they sat together, not as survivors of loss, but as witnesses of grace. And as the wind passed through the fields, carrying the scent of rain and earth, she whispered almost unconsciously, "It feels like he's here." He nodded. "He is." Days became weeks, and every small act became holy. He learned that worship was not confined to a place. It was woven into every moment of awareness, fixing a broken chair, making breakfast, listening to his son's laughter echo down the hallway. All of it was prayer. All of it was me. He would wake at dawn, the world still asleep, and sit in silence. Sometimes he would cry, sometimes he would smile. Always he would listen. And always I would be there, not as sound, but as stillness. "The wind," I whispered one morning, "is not me, but it carries my breath." He began noticing beauty in places he once overlooked. The cracked sidewalk sprouting a single flower. The old man at the market who smiled at everyone passing by. The sound of his own heartbeat after a long day, proof that grace still pulsed within him. He no longer sought miracles. He realized they were everywhere, in survival, in forgiveness, in the simple act of beginning again. He still faced struggles. Money was tight, the future uncertain, but his spirit no longer feared lack. He finally understood that peace is not the absence of storms, but the calm in the midst of them. One evening, he stood outside as the sun began to set. The sky burned with color, gold melting into crimson, fading into violet. He whispered, "I don't deserve all this." And I replied gently, "You never did. That's what makes it love." He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The wind brushed against his face, soft as a hand, and for the first time since his fall, he whispered not in despair, but in reverence, "I hear you." He didn't see it, but I smiled, because this is what I had been waiting for all along. Not obedience, not perfection, not promises. Just this, a quiet heart finally learning to listen. And in that listening, he had become what I always intended him to be. Not successful, not powerful, but whole. When he prayed for answers, I whispered, I gave him silence. When he prayed for rescue, I gave him endurance. But when he finally prayed for me, I gave him everything. That night, the wind outside his window whispered through the trees, and in its rhythm his soul found rest. For the first time, he no longer feared the silence. He had learned to hear my voice within it. I do not destroy what you are. I burn away what you are not. There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the warmth of grace turns to fire, not to punish, but to purify, not to end, but to begin again, truer, cleaner, whole. The man had found peace, but peace was only the surface. Beneath it still lived the ashes of pride, fear, and shame, things too heavy to carry where I was leading him next. So I stirred the embers of his past, because the healing of the heart is not complete until the soul faces the fire. It began one evening as he sat alone. The light from the window fell across his hands, those same hands that once built, grasped, and clung to everything he thought he owned. He looked at them and whispered, "I used these hands to build my kingdom, not yours." The words stung, but truth always burns before it frees. He began to remember the faces he had hurt, the friend he betrayed for profit, the promises broken in the name of ambition, the moments when love asked for time and he offered excuses instead. Each memory rose like smoke, filling the room with the scent of regret. And I stood within that smoke, unseen, whispering gently, "Do not run from the fire, my son. Let it consume what was never meant to survive." For hours he sat in silence, not begging to forget, but finally willing to see. He let every image, every word, every sin replay before him. And then, for the first time, he said it aloud, "I was wrong." The confession came not from guilt, but from clarity. It was the sound of chains breaking. And I, the refiner of hearts, breathed upon those chains until they melted like wax. The following days were heavy. He spoke little, smiled less. His wife noticed the faraway look in his eyes, but she did not interrupt. Something in her heart told her he was wrestling with something sacred. At night, he would walk outside, look up at the stars, and whisper his failures to the sky. And I would listen. Every word, every tear, every tremor of his voice. He thought he was confessing into emptiness. But I was there, collecting every word like jewels, not to judge, but to redeem. Then came the moment of surrender. He fell to his knees one evening, not out of despair, but out of awe. The weight of everything he'd been trying to carry had finally become too much. He cried out, "Take it, all of it. The pride, the fear, the guilt. I don't want to be that man anymore." And I answered, not in words, but in fire. It wasn't visible, but it was real. The fire moved through him, not burning flesh, but burning illusions, not destroying him, but refining him. He felt warmth in his chest, tears streaming down his face as if something old and dark was being lifted from within. I whispered as he trembled, "You are not being punished. You are being purified. I am burning away everything that is not love." He saw his life flash before him, not as regret, but as revelation. Every failure, every wound, every unanswered prayer, all of it had been part of this furnace of becoming. Nothing wasted, nothing random, nothing without purpose. When the fire subsided, he lay still, exhausted, emptied, reborn. The next morning, his wife found him sitting by the window, eyes red but shining. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He nodded slowly. "I think I finally am." She didn't know what had happened. She couldn't see the fire that had moved through his spirit, but she felt the warmth radiating from him, a calm that no storm could touch. He reached for her hand and whispered, "I spent my whole life trying to be strong, but now I know, and strength isn't what survives the fire, it's what's left after." She smiled, and for the first time, she saw not the man she married, but the man he had become, humbler, gentler, real. From that day forward, he walked differently, the same road, the same struggles, but his heart had changed shape, wide enough now to hold both sorrow and joy without breaking. He forgave people who never apologized. He blessed those who had once betrayed him. He stopped asking, "Why me?" and started asking, "What now?" Every step became sacred. Every breath became gratitude. And I, watching from the quiet, smiled, because now my reflection lived in him. "The fire does not destroy my children," I whispered. "It reveals the gold hidden inside their dust." He had entered the fire as a man who lost everything. He emerged as a man who understood that losing everything had given him the only thing that mattered, me. And though the world around him was still uncertain, within him there was only peace. Not because the storms had ended, but because he had become the storm's calm. The old you died in the flames, I told him, and the one who rose from the ashes is the one I always saw. When he woke, peace did not arrive like sunlight. It was already there, quiet, steady, waiting. The dawn came softly. There was no thunder, no revelation, no voice from heaven, just light filtering gently through the curtains, touching his face like a whisper. He opened his eyes, and for the first time in years, didn't feel the weight of the day pressing down. He sat up slowly. His heart was calm. His mind was still. And before any word left his lips, gratitude filled the room, silent, pure, unforced. He didn't yet realize that this was the miracle he had been waiting for. Not the return of everything he lost, but the rebirth of peace inside the emptiness. He went outside. The air was cool, scented with dew and soil. Birds called from the trees like old friends returning home. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. Each breath felt like a promise kept. "You see," I whispered, "resurrection doesn't come with trumpets. It begins when the soul decides to breathe again." He smiled faintly, unaware that the same lips which once cursed the storm now praised the quiet morning. He had no plan, no direction, and for the first time, that didn't frighten him. Because faith, true faith, no longer asks for maps. It learns to walk with me even when the road is hidden in mist. His wife joined him on the porch, holding 2 cups of coffee. They didn't speak at first. Words felt unnecessary. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was holy. She glanced at him and said softly, "You look different." He smiled. "Maybe I finally stopped trying to fix everything." She nodded. "And what did you do instead?" He looked at the sky. "I let God fix me." She didn't answer. She just reached out and held his hand, their fingers fitting together like a prayer answered without words. The days that followed moved gently, like pages turning in a book already written. He worked where he could, laughed when he could, forgave what he couldn't change, and every night he found himself whispering a simple phrase before sleep: "Thank you for today." Some days were still hard. The past still tried to speak, whispering guilt, regret, and fear. But now he knew the difference between his own voice and mine. I reminded him often, "The past is not your prison. It's the soil where your strength was grown." And slowly, he began to believe it. One afternoon, he visited the old street where his office once stood. The building was gone, replaced by something new. He stood there watching strangers walk where his dreams once were. He thought he would feel pain. He didn't. He only felt peace, as if he were finally free from everything that had once defined him. He whispered, "I thought losing all this was the end." And I replied, "No, it was the beginning of who you really are." He smiled, tears tracing silent paths down his cheeks, because now he understood the ashes had never been a grave. They had been the garden. He returned home before sunset. His son ran to him, arms open, laughter echoing like a hymn. As he lifted the boy into his arms, he thought, "This is wealth. Not what the world counts, but what heaven values." His wife called from the doorway, "Dinner's ready." He turned, holding his child close, and for the first time in years, he felt complete. Not because everything was perfect, but because perfection no longer mattered. That night as he lay in bed, he whispered to me, "I don't know what comes next." And I answered, "You don't have to. Just walk with me." He closed his eyes, and the silence that once haunted him now hummed with peace. And I looked upon him, my son, broken and remade, and said, "This is the first morning of the rest of eternity. When you wake to peace," I whispered as dawn returned the next day, "it's not because the world has changed, it's because you finally have." He walked back into the world, not as the man he once was, but as the reflection of the God who remade him. The world had not changed, but he had. The same roads stretched before him, the same voices filled the air, the same routines marked the days. And yet, everything looked new, as if heaven had painted the earth with softer colors. Even the air felt lighter now, not because the burdens had vanished, but because he no longer carried them alone. He woke early that morning before the light touched the rooftops. He looked in the mirror, and for the first time in years, he didn't see failure. He saw mercy. He saw a man who had walked through the valley of despair and found grace waiting on the other side. He whispered quietly, "Thank you." And I answered, "You are welcome, my son. But remember, gratitude is not the end of your journey. It is where love begins." He dressed simply, worn shoes, rolled sleeves, and a calm heart. There was work to do, not the kind measured in hours or money, but the sacred kind, the kind that rebuilds the world one act of kindness at a time. He visited his parents first. The door creaked open, and the look on their faces was a blend of relief and forgiveness. He had been distant for years, too proud to admit he needed anyone. Now he embraced them without words. The silence between them became prayer. His father, eyes glistening, murmured, "You've changed." He smiled. "I finally learned that change isn't losing who you are. It's remembering who you were meant to be." They sat together for hours, speaking little, sharing memories. He realized that love had never left. He had simply stopped seeing it. In the following days, he began repairing the small things he once ignored. A broken fence, a neglected garden, a forgotten promise. He visited old friends, not to boast, not to explain, but to say thank you and I'm sorry where needed. Each encounter was a small resurrection. Every forgiveness received, every wound healed, became part of the new temple I was building within him. Redemption, I whispered, is not found in grand gestures. It lives in the quiet moments where humility meets courage. He found work again, simple, honest, different from before. The pay was modest, but the purpose was rich. He greeted every customer as if they were sent from heaven, every task as an offering. He no longer worked to prove himself. He worked to serve, and that service became worship. Co-workers noticed something in him, a calm that defied logic, a light behind his eyes that no hardship could dim. One of them once asked, "What changed you?" He paused, then smiled softly. "Fire," he said, "but not the kind that destroys." At home, laughter returned. Not loud at first, gentle, hesitant, like a melody relearning its rhythm. His son climbed onto his lap one night and said, "Daddy, are you happy now?" He hugged him close. "I am," he said, "because I finally know I was never alone." His wife watched from across the room, tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of awe. The man before her wasn't the one who had lost everything. He was the one who had found what truly mattered. Weeks passed into months. Spring melted into summer, and the house began to breathe life again. Flowers on the table, open windows, sunlight falling across laughter and prayer. Every corner of their home felt like an altar, every meal like communion. He began helping others, men and women walking through the same valleys he once knew too well. He didn't preach. He simply listened, shared his scars, and spoke of a God who meets people not at their best, but at their breaking. And through him, I spoke. Through his gentleness, I comforted. Through his story, I healed. Through his weakness, I revealed my strength. When the broken tell their stories, I whispered, they become the hands I use to touch the world. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he stood by the window looking at the golden sky. He thought of everything, of the loss, the pain, the silence, the fire, the peace. And then he smiled, whispering to the wind, "You never left me, did you?" And I answered, "Not for a single breath." Tears welled in his eyes, but they were different now, not of sorrow, but of awe. He had walked through the ruins and found me waiting among them. He had broken, but in his breaking he had finally become whole. That night he knelt by his bed and prayed, not asking for anything, not seeking answers, but simply thanking me for the journey. He said, "If pain was the price to know you this way, and I would walk through it all again." And I, the Eternal, whispered with love deeper than words, "Then you have learned what it means to be mine." He thought the story was about loss, but it was always about love. When the world quieted and all the lights of his old life had gone out, he finally saw me clearly. Not in visions, not in miracles, not in the sky, but in the very hands that had trembled in despair, the same hands that had reached for me when they had nothing left to hold. He once believed that my love was proven through blessings. He now knew it was revealed through endurance, through the unseen strength that kept him breathing when he wanted to stop. He had asked me for restoration, but I had given him something far greater, revelation. Because what is the use of regaining everything if the heart still belongs to nothing? The years passed, the storms returned, as storms always do. But this time, he did not pray for me to remove them. He prayed for me to walk with him through them. And I did. Every new struggle became sacred ground. Every pain was now a doorway, not a wall. He had learned that love is not measured by protection from pain, but by presence within it. He did not teach sermons. He was one. Every smile, every kindness, every quiet forgiveness spoke louder than any verse could ever be read aloud. And people saw it, the light in his eyes, the calm in his movements. They would say, "There's something different about him." But what they really meant was, "We can see God in him." He often returned to that road, the one where he met the stranger. The bench was still there, the stream still whispered nearby. He would sit for hours not waiting for anyone, just watching the wind move through the trees. And sometimes, when his heart grew still enough, he would feel it again. That same quiet presence, that same voice, soft and infinite, moving through the air. "You were never alone," I would whisper. "Even when you thought you were dying, you were in my hands." And he would smile, eyes closed, letting tears fall like prayers fulfilled. Not because the pain had vanished, but because it no longer owned him. It had done its work and it had brought him home. He taught his child to pray differently, not to ask for things, but for understanding. Not to fear loss, but to find me in the middle of it. And when that child grew, he carried his father's quiet strength like an inheritance from heaven itself. Generations later, his story would be told again, not as a tragedy, but as testimony. A whisper passed down like faith itself from one soul to another, that God's silence is never absence, and his breaking is always rebuilding. And as for me, I still walk among the broken. I still breathe in the dust of those who think they have fallen too far. I still whisper to those on the floor, "You are not ruined, you are being remade." Because I am not the God of avoidance, I am the God of resurrection. And the same hands that shaped the stars still hold every shattered heart, waiting to make it whole again. He thought the story ended when he lost everything. But love, true love, never ends. So I kept watching him. Through the quiet years, the small joys, the slow fading of time. And when the final breath left his body, he did not fall. He rose, into light, into peace, into me. "Welcome home," I said. "You have always been mine." And as eternity unfolded before him, he finally understood. The breaking was never destruction. It was the sound of my hands shaping his soul. I watched him break, so I could make him whole. The end.